I'm so privileged to introduce our speakers, Jen Bowden and Haley Boehning, to talk with us about when stakeholder impact guides purpose, because getting to that single purpose for an organization isn't always the easiest thing in the world. Sometimes it's very complicated and takes a lot of work. And Jen and Haley are going to talk about how IGS Energy went through that process to get to a goal of carbon neutrality by 2040 and using that to unite the business and the community around them. Jen is currently the Vice President of Brand and Social Impact at IGS Energy based in Columbus, Ohio. And as such, Jen leads the marketing and social impact and was instrumental in even creating this unified purpose statement in the first place. Haley is the co-founder of StoryForge, where she helps ambitious leaders achieve the clarity and alignment necessary to get everyone and everything in their business on the same page so they can realize their vision and have the impact they desire. And you two are already starting to talk about how you are going back down memory lane for this. And so I just so want to say thank you for coming and sharing your wisdom and your experience with the Conscious Capitalism community today.
Absolutely. Thank you, and thank you to Conscious Capitalism, to the whole team who put this together and gave us the opportunity, Jen and I, to revisit this story over the last couple of weeks as we've been preparing to share it with you. So let's dive right in. Jen, this IGS story that we've been diving into is really in some ways kind of the classic conscious capitalism story. There are two ways that conscious capitalists are born. One, and as you might see in like a Whole Foods or Ben & Jerry's ice cream, where the founders go into their business as conscious capitalists, intentionally building everything using this philosophy as a framework. But in other cases, businesses come to conscious capitalism over time, having insights along the way. And that is, to me, a real exciting evolution for a company, and certainly where we are with IGS. So when I first met you and met the IGS leadership team, it was back in 2017. You were already on this journey toward conscious capitalism. But take us back to 2017. What led IGS to these insights around conscious capitalism?
Yeah, well, I think a few things were happening at that time. So I should note too that, you know, Haley, you and I have talked about the fact that IGS in its own way has really always been almost an unconsciously conscious company. Maybe we weren't fully sort of awake around the framework and the tenets, but absolutely there has always been sort of a stakeholder mentality that has driven our founders and our leadership. And I think that what has happened is over time that the definition of who is a stakeholder is what has changed and evolved. But in 2017, we were fortunate enough, we had a team of employees in a program internally, sort of a leadership development program called Empower Your Career. And those employees sort of identify and tackle business challenges to solve. And one of the groups in that year's cohort recognized a gap. They said, you know, we have a mission statement that says sort of what we do, we have a vision, we have values, we have a guiding principle, but nothing really describes why we do what we do. And we know from being employees here that the company is not sort of purpose or profits at all costs, right? There is even just a language where people say we care about purpose over profits, but no one was able to articulate when asked, well, we say purpose over profits, but what is that purpose? So this group of employees set out to tackle that question. And through the course of this conversation, I think that what they were able to sort of strike a nerve with our leadership group is that employees care about these things, consumers care about these things. And so it's not enough for a group of individuals at the top to sort of think that like employees are sitting around being like, if you have good perks, if we take care of them, that's enough. They really do want to connect to what we now know through the conscious capitalism framework is higher purpose.
That's great. And when we met in 2017, your leadership team had taken this feedback from this employee group and said, all right, we need to act on this. We need to define a purpose greater than profitability that can unite everyone, that can answer to what we believe from this employee group is their need for something greater than profitability to guide them. And then what's wonderful is this is a classic next step for companies that have been around for a while. The leadership team went away into a room and attempted to come up with that purpose statement on their own in a beautiful little vacuum. So tell us how that went and what the next steps were for the company at that moment.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. IGS is a organization where at the time you would describe us as a typical sort of like the life cycle we are in and sort of now sort of maturing from is that sort of go-go lifestyle. So one of the things that means is our leaders take action. They see something, they go, 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 go. And so that was the approach that they employed. And I think that what ended up happening through that process is that sometimes, individuals are coming to this with their own view of the world and their own perspective and their own experiences. And what the step that I think got overlooked in that process is really starting with who are our stakeholders? What do they think our purpose is? And how do we get feedback from them? In sort of that classic, like move with our leadership group to like take action and be very entrepreneurial and get things done. The initial sort of iteration to that was, I think that the initial purpose statement was like 15 bullet points. It had everything thrown in there because we wanted everyone's, perspective incorporated, and it just became sort of this jumbled, both like very long, but also non-specific definition of what our purpose was.
Yes. Yeah, and that's when StoryForge was engaged by you and by the IGS leadership team to come in, and it was not for lack of passion or desire or ideas. It was really for lack of stakeholder engagement. So yeah. When the business leaders were in that conference room and we were all sitting there with the 17 purpose statements in front of us and all of the words describing vision and beliefs, it was a narrowing exercise. But interestingly, a narrowing exercise without a filter. It was a conversation where one leader said, well, I like this one better. And another saying, well, I like this one better. And that, I think, was the first insight that the leadership team had, was that the conversation about purpose couldn't be about whether we like one or like the other. It had to be whether the purpose statements worked. And whether they worked against this filter of who are we, who do we want to be, what do we believe, and then that final essential piece that I'd love for you to dive into, which is who are our stakeholders? What do they say? What do they want? What do they need? So maybe you could talk a little bit about what that then initial stakeholder engagement looked like. Who do we talk to and how many?
Yeah, so at that point, I think Haley, you and your partner Barry were able to get the group to realize that, like, hey, we got to get outside of ourselves a little bit here and really identify those stakeholders and talk to them. And so there was an engagement process. You all engaged, I think, 80 something interviews with stakeholders. That was everyone from board members, who in our case we are a family-owned company. So members of our board, employees, customers, some vendors and partners. And at that point, we hadn't yet defined the environment as a stakeholder. So we were, really focused on sort of business partnerships. And through that feedback, what we learned is that some of the things that those stakeholders saw in us were not necessarily the things that we overlooked them, or we didn't necessarily think of those as the things that should be a point of pride. We were very humble. We had sort of that Midwestern approach that, like, we don't talk about these things. We want to have humility.
Yeah. And there was something else I think that was interesting as I look back at those stakeholder interviews. some of the things were very obvious to our stakeholders, and weren't, as you said, as obvious to us, to the IGS Energy team, that your stakeholders really cared about the environment. They cared about sustainability. They cared about green energy. They were concerned about the future of energy, but they felt powerless to do anything about it. And so those were not conversations that came up in interviews where we asked specifically about IGS Energy. We were looking for, what do these stakeholders want? What do they need? What do they believe? Just around energy in general. And then helping to connect the dots between what the IGS Energy team was all about and believed and what they saw as the future and what your stakeholders found. It's the old classic Venn diagram, finding where those things overlapped. So as these stakeholder insights brought you to this idea that, yes, customers cared about transparency. Yes, customers care about the price of energy, the cost of energy, but they really do care about green energy and the environment, and that it was important to all of your stakeholders that the company not only hold strongly held beliefs about the future and have a vision for the future, but that actions align with that vision, and that what you do and how you do it align with why you do it. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how you managed that with your leadership team, some of whom were maybe resistant to the changes that needed to come as a result.
Yeah, so that actually is sort of the story of the last 3 years at IGS. And I always like to say that I think that the engagement with you all, where we were working on that initial, what I'll say, our initial purpose statement, really planted the seed to help start to kind of get the wheels turning and start that dialogue at the highest level. Because just, with the honesty that we share in this conscious capitalism community, like, it wasn't a home run out of the park initially. We had some folks in our leadership team for whom, their mindset was, well, yeah, climate change is real. We are working, we're working on new products and new ways to talk about this, but like, we don't want to alienate anyone. And because climate change had, even at that time, and now more so, become really a politicized issue, they had a fear, quite honestly, that if we talk about these things in a public and sort of, a true to who we are fashion, that might turn somebody off. And so really, I would say that over the course of the year after that initial engagement, that's some of the work we were focused on. But what it resulted in is that our first go round at a purpose statement was something that was, it was compelling and it was uniting for the organization, but it was not as specific as what I think we found some people, most importantly our employees, were really hoping for. So just to sort of get into brass tacks here, what we arrived at was a purpose statement, is that IGS Energy's purpose was to build a meaningful energy future together. And implied and meaningful to our leadership team was, well, that would be sustainable. And when and so I think that, there was this level of like, okay, that will not be necessarily, something that is, a charged word, because we just hadn't come to terms with the fact that sometimes when you believe in something and it's who you stand for, there are going to be people who may be opposed to that. And so I think it was gaining confidence in seeing ourselves that way. And again, a little bit of sort of our Midwestern humble, humility was a little bit of a barrier for us as we thought about really sort of claiming our stake and what it was to really define our purpose.
It's interesting to think about we all think about purpose statements as manifestos, right? We're gonna put this stake in the ground and it's gonna be bold, and we're going to immediately change the entire company using one phrase, and then everything will be different from that moment forward. But it sounds like for you, Jen, and for the IGS team, it was the slow application of those insights in a methodical process over many years, not just getting the leadership team through their change curve, but also bringing the business along with you in terms of the people, your stakeholders, your processes, your goals. So tell us now, if you could, where you are now with your purpose statement, where you are now with your vision statement, and what changed from that initial phrase of building a meaningful energy future together.
Yeah. So like we mentioned, I view that first iteration as really the seed that has led us to where we are today. And where we are today is that IGS Energy says that our purpose statement is to build a sustainable energy future for a healthier planet. And to go along with that, we've backed it up with a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2040. We've shifted on our products for residential consumers. We're 100% renewable. We are making similar moves on the commercial industrial side, just a little bit of a longer transition there. But I think that what has happened since that initial time is it has given us the ability to really take sort of a measured approach to move into this. And I think that that's important because a lot of times, even when you read the book Conscious Capitalism, and there's examples in there, or you go to a Conscious Capitalism event and they have the amazing folks telling their story from the stage. Sometimes it does seem like it is almost like a switch is flipped, or companies are inherently born this way. And I think that the reality is there are many more companies out there for whom this is a bit of a journey, and all journeys have to start someplace. So that initial definition of our purpose statement, I think, was really the launch pad for us to start to ask ourselves, well, if we say meaningful, what does that mean? What does meaningful mean?
Yeah.
And how are we leveraging that purpose statement to drive our product strategy? And for our leadership team, as they sit around the table, as they think about sort of our 10-year vision, saying, if our purpose statement is true in 10 years, what does that mean? What does that mean for our company? What does that mean in terms of the products we're offering? And really just growing some comfort and confidence in our ability to deliver on that. And I think that probably was a big part of it is, we are a group of people who want to be authentic beyond anything else at IGS Energy. And so we did also have a little bit of this fear that if we put something out there, are we going to be able to ourselves live up to it? And so this past few years has given us the opportunity to really prove to ourselves more than anyone else that we're capable of it. And if not us, then who? Because there are a lot of other energy companies out there that, for a host of other reasons, whether it's because they're public or they're entrenched in sort of like, just sort of the status quo of how we've generated and sourced power and energy, natural gas in the United States. They're far more heavily invested in those things. And so, it really became this sense of duty and obligation for us to say, who else is going to do this if we're not, and really see ourselves in a leadership role?
Yeah,
but that's taken time.
Yeah, and I thank you for you and the IGS leadership team for being examples of telling and living the same story, which is something we see a lot. And I imagine many of our audience members who are listening in will have that same reaction. What is greenwashing, right? There's a reason that term exists, because there are a lot of people out there talking one game, but making very, very different decisions, where your leadership team was very conscious of the fact that you're creating a filter for thinking. And once we create this and we codify our thinking about our purpose and our beliefs and our vision, we have to make decisions based on those very difficult and bold decisions that we're making. So one last question perhaps, and then I want to move us to talk a little bit about Conscious Capitalism Columbus and the chapter and how IGS has been a part of that. One of the things we hear a lot about in stakeholder engagement discussions is as businesses go out, they look at what their investors need and want, what their employees need and want, what the company itself needs and wants. that there must be some trade-off. There must be an either or. But you worked very, very hard to find synergies between those needs and to look for ands. Maybe you could speak to that, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this is just rooted in the fact that we are in a industry, in a business that, we've had 30 years sort of invested in the status quo of how things used to be. So for us to think about switching overnight, it couldn't be an either or thing. We did have to think about and how are we going to make this transition? But I think we are guided by long-term thinking, which gives us a lot of leeway to do just what you talked about, Haley, is it can be both things at once. So we can acknowledge that, for example, IGS is a company that, we supply businesses and houses with natural gas. I don't think everyone in the world is going to go and, buy a different type of way to cook their food tomorrow. So how do we do that in a better way and help educate our partners and stakeholders on how we can make this transition, and how over time it can be both things at once. We can be working toward the future while sort of transitioning from where we are today. And that is, I think, a place that is sometimes hard because we do have sort of a limited, many people sort of have this zero-sum mentality. And a lot of that is just born really from our leadership encouraging a different way of thinking, which is both at once.
That's great. Well, thank you. And we're very fortunate here in Columbus to have had you. Both of us are founding members of the Columbus chapter of Conscious Capitalism. And we've talked a lot about how having IGS, not just Jen, but having IGS as a founding member of this chapter has changed the way perhaps our chapter has evolved, and enabled us to do different things. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how having the whole of IGS behind us as a new chapter has made a difference.
Yeah, so, well, I'm really fortunate because coming as a board leader to the Conscious Capitalism community in Columbus and having the backing of IGS is great. I think some of the reason why we've been able to do that is because Scott White, our CEO, has said part of his personal mission is to help sort of change the reputation of capitalism. Just a little side note, when we were going through that purpose work, he had an experience with his daughter where he had floated an idea by her where he said, I think in our purpose statement, we should say something about how IGS Energy is a role model for capitalism. And his daughter at the time was a college student. And she said, that word disgusts me. I don't want it put into that purpose statement. And it started a really healthy dialogue. But I think it sort of lit a fire for him to say, how can I change the hearts and minds of people for whom capitalism has become this really tarnished philosophy and this tarnished idea. And so Scott has given the company permission to say, okay, what more can we do? How can we look at this idea of being a role model and take it a little bit further even than just our own actions and behaviors? How do we inspire others? So we support the local chapter of Conscious Capitalism. Scott's engaged at the international level. We do book clubs inside of IGS with employees around Conscious Capitalism and the Healing Organization and the Field Guide. And so really it's just become something where he has empowered the employees to say, how do we become embodiments of this sort of out in the world?
That's great. Embodiments of the philosophy as conscious capitalism. So how does that, there is one maybe unique thing about the Columbus business community that you and I have talked about before that we think might be another of those secret sauces to why our chapter has so much engagement here. Can you talk about that and maybe share with others who are on this meeting from other communities what that is and how they might leverage that in their own communities?
Yeah, so there is a term that floats around Central Ohio, and it's called the Columbus Way. And actually, interestingly, there is a class taught at Harvard Business School called The Columbus Way. And it is about how within a community, corporations and the public sector can coalesce around a certain set of shared values and shared goals and vision for the community to advance those, as opposed to sort of working in sort of a traditionally oppositional or competitive way. So really it's about saying, like, we all want to see some common things get better or change or advance in our communities. How do we partner on those things in a truly partner, stakeholder mentality? And so how that shows up in Columbus is that somebody like me who, I'm not an executive by any stretch, but I could reach out to someone at the C-level of almost every company, I would say virtually every company in Columbus, and they will return my phone call. There's an incredible amount of accessibility and, just sort of esprit de corps. And I think that helps advance efforts like our chapter here in Central Ohio.
Yeah, there's a wonderful tradition in Columbus of, and obviously we all have egos. Egos exist. So this is not a perfect scenario, but a lot more egoless partnerships across organizations, partnerships between private and public sector organizations, and people. And I have to say, you demur too much, Jen, in saying you're not an executive, because you both are an executive in title, but also perhaps more important, a leader with a lowercase L, in the sense that you take a leadership role in many things in our community and see those synergies and see those opportunities for us to help each other make the community better. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I want to be, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Haley, I think that it's worth noting, if you want to share maybe a quick example of how that sort of Columbus way comes to life. Do you want to talk a little bit about the letter that you and John Lowe, the CEO of Jenny's Ice Cream, sort of helped put out to the community and what the response was? Because I think it's an impressive way to demonstrate sort of that work in action.
Sure. And I'll talk about it, and I'll also say that as I look back on that month, it reminds me of an old black and white Mickey Rooney movie where grandma's going to lose the farm. And so everybody comes together and says, what can we do? Let's put on a show. I can build a stage and I can make the costumes and I can sing and I can dance. And then they put on a big musical and it saves the farm. It's that idea of all of us coming together and using whatever strengths we have to put behind something that we believe very strongly in. So back in May and June, as our country began to very, very publicly wrestle with what we were seeing in the news over and over again, of police brutality, of racism showing its face in the structures of our country. John Lowe, who is also one of our founding board members, the CEO of Jenny's Splendid Ice Creams, an amazing founder-led, purpose-driven B Corp that is based here in Columbus, Ohio. As John was wrestling with what to do and a feeling that something must be done, he must do something. He received a call from the president of our city council here, Shannon Harding, asking for his help in support of a resolution that our city council was going to pass, and did pass on June 1st of this year, declaring racism to be a public health crisis in our community and committing to do something about it. And so John and I talked and decided to write that letter and share it with other CEOs, other business leaders in our community, to say we need our voices to be spoken and we need our voices to be heard, because if we're silent on this issue, it feels complicit. And this is not a place for us to be neutral. So we developed a letter. We sent it out to other CEOs that we thought might be interested in joining us and putting their name to this letter, both declaring racism to be a public health crisis, but also committing to do work ourselves as individuals, as leaders within our organizations and in our community to combat racism. We sent it out on a Friday afternoon asking some friends to sign it and share it with other CEOs that they were friendly with that they thought might also want to add their name. And in about 48 to 72 hours, we had about 750 CEOs of some of the largest and the smallest organizations and companies in Columbus sign the letter. So that to me is an example of what can be done when you don't really care who gets the credit, when you think about how we can partner public and private together to make change. So we're just humbled and delighted at the outpouring of support that the letter got, and the ability not just to sign the letter, but for the CEOs who signed that letter to take that commitment to heart and actually take action.
And I've continued to engage them to sort of provide that accountability, that it wasn't just sort of an empty action of signing something, that there's work that's following it.
Yeah, there's been a lot of what people would call performative actions in the last year, really, on this subject, and we're very committed to doing the hard work, the long work, the reflective work to make sure that we don't fall into that trap. So thank you for asking.
Yeah.
I think it's time for us potentially to move to Q&A to answer whatever questions those of you who are on the call have. So I'll turn it over to Michael to help us with that.
Absolutely. Welcome everyone to today's conversation. If you have a question for Jen or Haley, please just add your question to the Q&A field. You can find that in the lower portion of the Zoom interface. But we'll go ahead and take some of these questions from the audience. I'm going to roll two questions into one here. We have a question from Bernard, and Jen, this is a question for you. What guidance would you give to firms seeking to identify and be in dialogue with external stakeholders? And adding on to that, when you went through the process of stakeholder engagement, who conducted the interviews? Was that something that you co-collaborated together with Haley with the IGS, or how did that process work?
Yeah, so I'll talk really quickly, but I'll also then defer to Haley, because the short answer is Haley and her team conducted those interviews. I would say in terms of, and this might be true for others, initially when we went down, this was the first time that we had done an exercise like this. We have lots of customers who we're in communication with all the time. But when you think about extending that relationship to a third party, where let's say, for example, the salesperson who typically sort of is the person who's sort of managing that relationship isn't engaged, that isn't a little bit takes a leap of faith when we've never done something like this before. So it did take a little bit of convincing, I guess would be the right word, convincing on our part, and then, trust on the part of like our sales teams, for example, that like no one's going to come in and ask these partners to talk about the, something terrible about our company, but really seeing it as an opportunity to get feedback and really understanding and insight about ourselves. And so initially we did have to, just build some trust with those sales groups, especially that like, this is going to be okay. And I think it was quickly, we were able to quickly demonstrate to them how beneficial that feedback was. And we've actually used it as a good stepping off process for some of the work we were already hoping to do on our marketing team, just with doing a much better job of getting consumer insights and gaining an understanding from sort of that consumer perspective. So it was a great jumping off point for that, but I'll let Haley answer the question in terms of the second part of that question around how those conversations actually happen.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned those two things, Jen, both that the initial stakeholder engagement can be kind of terrifying if you've never done it before. And also that often those stakeholder engagements, once they happen and people see that they're not very scary and that they're super, super valuable, it creates this desire to constantly do them. So there is, in a business, especially a business that's been around as long and has been as successful as IGS Energy, there's something that my friends in the retail world will know as customer intimacy. You get to know your customers so well that you can predict what they want. But that can also be dangerous. So it's very important, I think, Bernard, to your question, to make sure that you have someone outside the business conduct those customer interviews. Because it's not just a question of data collection. It's not just a question of multiple choice questions. Do you like A or B, C or D? It's really an informed dialogue and following those answers that people give down whatever rabbit holes they are to find the insights that are not obvious on the surface. And then combining this external third-party engagement of your stakeholders with the incredible customer intimacy and knowledge that you already have to have insights, to make observations, to see patterns and themes. So that's a lot of what we at StoryForge were engaged to do for IGS, was to have those dialogues, have that conversation. But it all starts with something that Jen talked about earlier, which is stakeholder mapping. Mapping your stakeholders. And often with our clients, when we say, we want to talk with your current clients, we want to talk with former clients. We want to talk with people who fired you, who don't want to work with you, or who have struggled to see why they should. We want to talk with your partners, with your vendors. We want to talk with the cleaning company that's worked for your business for the last 40 years, because often they have incredible insights about who you really are and what your strengths are and what you're best at, that don't come necessarily from just your customers or just your employees. Hopefully that answers your question, Bernard.
Wonderful. Thank you, Haley. Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, did you end up alienating anyone? Did you end up alienating anyone the way in the leadership circles when you were explicit about sustainability? And if so, how did you respond?
So I would say that we absolutely, when we made this announcement about net zero by 2040 and our new product offering, really came out with like a new brand just in August of this year. And that's really when it sort of hit this place where internally people had maybe a little more anxiety, and it was that they wanted to feel prepared for what to do, how to respond when a client calls you and says, I don't want to do business with you, maybe, or I don't believe the same things, or this isn't my thing. So, so I can tell you that it happened, but very, very small case of it. And we did a lot of work leading up to making sure that people felt really confident that they had ways to respond that were really rooted in, well, this is why we're making this decision. And I can respect that you have a different opinion, and that's okay. But in order for us to be deeply committed to this, we can't be one size fit all. We can't be something for everyone, because we're really committed to being a leader in sustainable energy. And so, so it happened. I can tell you though, that what helped our leadership team feel better when it happened, it didn't happen, we didn't see droves of people, right? But prepping the people internally who are going to be exposed to those conversations and making sure, we did role playing, we developed 1 million FAQs, we talked about it a lot. Just having that level of familiarity and really comfort with the fact that this may happen is what I think helped us there. And we didn't try to sort of keep it from them. We didn't try to be like, well, let's not mention the fact that this might be alienating to somebody. Let's not pretend this might not happen. Let's explore it. Let's go down. What happens when that happens? And so sort of even just that role playing and mentally preparing for when it would happen, just in case, really helped build the confidence internally. And at the end of the day, now, I think that some of the people who may have been most hesitant up front are some of our biggest champions of it, of the shift that we've made.
If I could add on to that as well, Michael, and this, I want to preface this by saying this is not the case with IGS, but for other people who might be wondering this on the call or thinking about their businesses, often this kind of work, this work to discover insights, to define a vision and a purpose and beliefs, it's very difficult work. It's very hard work. And it often shows or reveals gaps in the organization between the aspirational vision, mission, purpose, and beliefs, and then how those play out in the organization, either through org structure, through leadership, through people, through process, products and services. So we've seen a lot of businesses go through the kind of work that IGS has gone through and sell business lines, get into new products and services they weren't in earlier. And also we have seen a lot of leadership change come out of these kind of conversations as people begin to understand the true complexity and the real positions that companies are taking and feel the need to either opt in more strongly or opt out and say, this is not the kind of company where I want to work. But we've also seen people just as passionately say, thank goodness, I'm now more engaged and re-engaged in this company than I ever have been. But it does happen.
Wonderful. In the interest of time, I'm going to fold the, again, I'll combine two questions into one. But I want to focus on, Jen, you had shared how your purpose statement was integral to your journey in IGS's journey in becoming practitioners of conscious capitalism. So the question is, are there any cautions that you would flag in writing the purpose statement? And then as IGS went through the process of writing the purpose statement, what are the things that you got right, or what would you do differently if you were to go through that process again? And that will be our final question.
Yeah, so I would say, I don't know that I change anything, because quite honestly, it took all of that for us to get to this place. But I think that, in some ways, we likely could have fast forwarded through the exercise where our executives tried to wrestle with this themselves. But in some ways it served a purpose, right? Because it did build their comfort and their familiarity with this concept. And so it was a reflective process for them. I also think that, on the surface, you could look at this and say, well, 2 years later, you all came back and revised your purpose statement where, you did say build a meaningful energy future together. And now you've come back and said, you've substituted it and sort of evolved it. I wouldn't categorize that as a mistake either, just because, again, that was part of our journey. It was part of our evolution. And so, there's not a lot that I would look back at and maybe think of as a mistake. I think something for many of us who are here in this conscious capitalism community is we are people who have an appetite for change. We are more comfortable with the ambiguity and maybe thinking about what can be and what should be in the future. And I know for myself personally, I'm quite impatient about that. And so something that I've learned through this process that I think we can all have as sort of a watch out is to recognize that not everyone around the table has that same level of appetite for risk or for change. And so really making sure that we are adjusting our style and how we bring people like that along who may be at an opposite end of a spectrum from us, to help make sure that their voice is at the table. Because I learned some meaningful things that probably I was not, if I had just trailblazed this thing through as fast as I wanted to, we probably wouldn't have ended up with as strong as an outcome and as deeply committed to this, if in year one, when we worked with Haley, it was sustainable energy future, right? We would have skipped over some steps that were really important for us to get to this place where we made the carbon neutrality commitment and stuff like that. So I think it's, as we're asking our organizations to be stakeholder aligned, we ourselves have to also be stakeholder aligned and really meet people where they're at to bring them along in the process.
Jen, Haley, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Haley, thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Jen.
everyone.